January 1st, 1945. The village of Chenogne, Belgium, is burning. Smoke drifts low over the frozen Ardennes landscape, mixing with the biting mist of a winter morning. In a field just outside the ruined hamlet, the silence is heavier than the artillery barrage that preceded it. 60 men lie in the snow. They are not deployed in defensive positions. They are not clutching rifles. They are piled in heaps, their grey greatcoats riddled with machine gun fire, their hands empty. These are German soldiers, dead not by the chaotic fortune of combat, but by the cold, deliberate mechanics of a firing squad. Standing over them are young men from the U.S. 11th Armored Division, boys from Ohio, California, and New York who have just crossed a line that military law says should never be crossed. There is no cheering, just the sound of cooling metal ticking in the freezing air and the steam rising from 60 fresh corpses. This is the dark mirror of the American liberation, a secret that will travel all the way from this bloody field to the desk of General George S. Patton, forcing a choice between the demands of justice and the brutal necessities of total war. To understand why a company of American soldiers would line up unarmed men and execute them in a snowy field, one must look 2 weeks backward in time and 20 miles to the east. By late December 1944, the Western Front had devolved into a freezing nightmare. Adolf Hitler had launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a massive, desperate armored counter-offensive through the dense forests of the Ardennes intended to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The American lines, thinly held by exhausted units recovering from fighting in the Hürtgen forest and Green divisions fresh from the States, buckled under the weight of the German panzer divisions. The chaos of the initial breakthrough created a fog of war in which units were cut off, communications were severed, and paranoia ran rampant. But it was an event on December 17th at the Beaunier crossroads near Malmedy that fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the battle. Here, elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, a spearhead unit of the 1st SS Panzer Division led by Joachim Peiper, captured a convoy of the U.S. 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. What followed was not a standard prisoner intake, but a slaughter. Over 80 American prisoners of war were gunned down in a field, their bodies left to freeze in the snow. News of the Malmedy Massacre did not trickle down the American lines. It exploded across them. Survivors who had feigned death escaped into the woods and were picked up by friendly units, telling horrific stories of SS troopers walking among the wounded and finishing them off with pistol shots to the head. These accounts, magnified by fear and rage, traveled instantly via radio and word of mouth across the entire 3rd and 1st Army sectors. The effect on the average American GI was immediate and toxic. Until this moment, many American combat troops had maintained a grudging, professional respect for the Wehrmacht, distinguishing between the regular German army and the fanatical, political soldiers of the SS. Malmedy erased that distinction. The narrative shifted from a war of liberation to a war of extermination. Commanders did little to dampen this fury. In some cases, they stoked it. While official written orders from General Eisenhower strictly adhered to the Geneva Convention, the unwritten orders circulating at the battalion and company levels were far darker. A documented order from the headquarters of the 328th Infantry Regiment, issued on December 21st, stated explicitly that no SS troops or paratroopers will be taken prisoner, but will be shot on sight. This was the atmosphere pervading the Ardennes as the year turned. The weather had grounded Allied air power, the temperatures had plummeted to near-record lows, and the fighting had become a savage close-quarters struggle for survival. Every German surrender was viewed with deep suspicion, and every SS uniform was seen not as a soldier of a hostile nation, but as a criminal marked for death. The rules of civilized warfare were freezing over along with the ground. Into this cauldron of vengeance and desperation stepped the US 11th Armored Division. They were not battle-hardened veterans of North Africa or Normandy who had learned to moderate their emotions. They were fresh, eager, and terrified. Known as the Thunderbolt Division, they arrived in the theater just as the Battle of the Bulge was reaching its crisis point. They had traveled across France in open trucks, freezing in the bitter cold, listening to the stories of Malmedy, and preparing themselves to face the monsters they had heard about in the rumors. They were a weapon primed to fire, lacking only a target. The 11th Armored Division landed in France on December 16, 1944, the exact day Hitler launched his offensive. They were not eased into the war. There were no quiet sectors for acclimation, no gradual introductions to the sounds and smells of the battlefield. Instead, they were rushed across France in a frantic forced march to plug the crumbling lines in Belgium. They arrived at the front just as the siege of Bastogne was broken, thrown immediately under the command of General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton was a commander who viewed momentum as a tangible physical force. He demanded aggression, speed, and violence of action. For a Green Division like the 11th, this pressure was suffocating. Their objective was critical. They were to secure the southern flank of the Bastogne corridor and push north to meet the First Army, effectively pinching off the German salient and trapping the enemy forces inside the Bulge. Standing directly in their path was the village of Chenogne. Chenogne was not merely a cluster of farmhouses. It was a strategic choke point occupied by remnants of the Panzer Lehr Division and the Führer Begleit Brigade. These were not the bottom-barrel scrapings of the Third Reich's manpower pool. They were elite, mechanized veterans equipped with heavy armor and driven by the desperation of a collapsing front. They had turned the stone ruins of Chenogne into a fortress, digging into the frozen cellars and positioning anti-tank weapons to cover the snowy approaches. For the young soldiers of the 11th Armored, the assault on Chenogne on December 30th and 31st became a brutal initiation. The fighting was confused and terrifying. German artillery pounded the open fields, turning the white snow into a cratered moonscape of black earth and red mist. American tanks bogged down in the ice or were gutted by Panzerfaust fired from close range. The infantry, exposed and freezing, suffered heavy casualties. Platoon leaders were killed within hours of stepping off the line of departure. Squads were separated in the dense woods. The psychological toll of these first 48 hours of combat cannot be overstated. These men were watching their friends die in horrific ways, shattered by mortar rounds or cut down by machine gun fire from invisible positions. The abstract hatred of the enemy, fueled by the Malmedy rumors, was now cemented by the visceral, personal grief of immediate loss. Every German resisting in Chenogne was seen as responsible for the death of a buddy just moments before. By the morning of January the 3rd, 1945, the 11th Armored had succeeded in pushing into the village. The cost had been exorbitant. The division was physically depleted and emotionally raw. They had survived their baptism of fire, but it had stripped away their innocence and replaced it with a cold, jagged hardness. They were no longer the fresh-faced boys who had landed in Cherbourg 2 weeks prior. They were survivors standing in the wreckage of a burning village, adrenaline fading into exhaustion, looking for someone to blame for the carnage surrounding them. The surrender of the German garrison was imminent, but the men accepting that surrender were operating in a moral vacuum where the normal laws of human conduct had been suspended by trauma. To label the events at Chenogne as a spontaneous outburst of rage is to ignore the complex machinery of command that set the stage for it. A massacre does not begin with the pulling of a trigger. It begins with the erosion of restraint. In the Third Army sector, during the Battle of the Bulge, restraint was a luxury that few commanders felt they could afford. General George S. Patton was a commander who operated on the psychological edge of warfare. He understood that an army's lethality was directly tied to its ferocity. While there is no surviving written order from Patton explicitly commanding the execution of prisoners of war, the atmosphere he cultivated often rendered written orders secondary to the commander's intent. Patton's diary entry from January 4th, 1945, days after the Chenogne incident, reveals his mindset, noting that the 11th Armoured is very green and took unnecessary losses to no effect, and that there were also some unfortunate incidents in the shooting of prisoners, adding that he hoped they could conceal this. The key word is unfortunate, not criminal. For Patton, the crime was not the moral failing of killing unarmed men, but the operational failure of getting caught, or creating a scandal that could slow his advance. Lower down the chain of command, the nuance vanished entirely. General Troy Middleton, commanding the 8th Corps, had issued instructions regarding SS troops that traveled down to the divisional level. These instructions were interpreted by tired, angry officers in the field as a license to kill. By the time these directives reached the sergeants and privates of the 11th Armoured Division, they had been stripped of all legalese. They arrived simply as, "The SS take no prisoners, neither do we." This dangerous game of telephone created a permissive environment where a soldier could believe he was following orders by committing murder. The moral burdens was lifted from the individual trigger puller and placed on a nebulous they, the officers, the brass, the army itself. In the freezing foxholes around Chenogne, the prevailing wisdom was that bringing in prisoners was a dangerous hassle that slowed down the unit and exposed them to treachery. The hatred directed at the German forces in Chenogne was specific. American GIs had been briefed to look for the Schutzstaffel, the SS. These were the men of the Nazi political elite, the perpetrators of Malmedy, easily identifiable by their lightning bolt runes and, occasionally, black panzer wraps. However, in the chaos of the Ardennes, identification was rarely precise. The German defenders of Chenogne were a mixed bag. Some were indeed hardcore veterans of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite unit formed from Hitler's personal escort battalion. But others were Wehrmacht regulars, teenage conscripts, or Volksturm militia thrown into the line. To a terrified American teenager peering through the sights of an M1 Garand in a blizzard, these distinctions were invisible. The tragedy of Chenogne is compounded by this confusion. The American soldiers were hunting monsters, but the men they lined up were often just exhausted soldiers of the Wehrmacht. The SS label became a blanket justification applied to anyone who shot back. The mere suspicion of SS affiliation, a camouflage smock, a certain type of field cap, or just a stubborn defense was enough to sign a prisoner's death warrant. The psychological conditioning was absolute. American training films and battlefield rumors had painted the SS not as human beings, but as rabid animals that could not be tamed, only put down. When the 11th Armored Soldiers looked at the men surrendering from the smoking ruins of Chenogne, they didn't see surrendered combatants protected by the Geneva Convention. They saw the ghosts of their friends murdered at Malmedy. They saw an enemy that had forfeited the right to live. And because the chain of command had turned a blind eye to previous infractions, the soldiers felt empowered to act as judge, jury, and executioner on the spot. The moral collapse at Chenogne was not just a product of propaganda, it was forged in the specific, terrifying geometry of the battlefield itself. The battle for Chenogne was a tactical nightmare. It wasn't a contest of maneuver across open fields. It was a claustrophobic, vertical war fought in the shattered remains of Belgian farmhouses. The Germans had turned every cellar into a bunker and every attic into a sniper's nest. For the infantry of the 21st Armoured Infantry Battalion, the fight dissolved into a series of violent, isolated vignettes. A squad would kick down a door, only to be met by the buzz of an MG-42 machine gun. Grenades were tossed into dark stairwells, followed by the roar of explosions and the screams of the wounded. Flamethrowers were brought up to clear stubborn strongpoints, filling the freezing air with the smell of burning fuel and flesh. In this environment, the distinction between a combatant and a corpse was often measured in split seconds. Soldiers learned quickly that hesitation meant death. The fog of war here was literal. Smoke from burning thatched roofs mixed with the winter mist, reducing visibility to mere yards. This sensory deprivation heightened the paranoia. A movement in a window wasn't investigated, it was obliterated. By the time the village was declared secure, the nerves of the survivors were pulled taut, vibrating with an adrenaline overdose that didn't simply vanish when the shooting stopped. The men of Company B, 21st Armoured Infantry Battalion, who would ultimately carry out the massacre, were operating at the absolute limit of human endurance. They had been awake for days, shivering in foxholes, dug into frozen earth that felt like concrete. Their uniforms were stiff with mud and ice. They were hungry, they were sick, and they were watching their friends bleed out in the snow. Combat exhaustion strips away the layers of civilization. It reduces a man to his most primal instincts, survival and rage. Psychologists in World War II noted that after intense, sustained combat, soldiers often entered a state of emotional anesthesia, a numbness where killing no longer registered as a moral act, but simply as a mechanical necessity to remove a threat. But at Chenogne, this numbness was overlaid with a sharp, piercing vindictiveness. As the fighting wound down on New Year's Day, the survivors looked around at the devastation. They saw the bodies of their platoon mates draped over fences or crushed under tank treads. The grief turned instantly to a need for retribution. They didn't want the battle to end with the orderly processing of paperwork. They wanted it to end in blood. The enemy soldiers emerging from the rubble weren't seen as men who had done their duty. They were the architects of this misery. And in that moment of fragile silence between the battle and the peace, the discipline of the 11th Armored Division snapped. By the early afternoon of January 1st, the caliber of the noise in Chenogne shifted. The heavy thumping of tank guns and the rhythmic tearing of machine gun fire slowly gave way to the lighter, sporadic popping of small arms mopping up resistance. Then a strange quiet descended over the smouldering ruins. From the cellars of the shattered farmhouses, the grey shapes began to emerge. They came out slowly, hands clasped behind their heads, or raised high in the freezing air. These were the defenders of Chenogne. Stripped of their defensive positions and their heavy weapons, they looked less like the Aryan super soldiers of Goebbels' newsreels, and more like what they actually were: exhausted, filthy men, shivering in the biting wind. Some were wounded, their bandages seeping red into the dirty field grey of their wool uniforms. Others were practically children, their eyes wide with the shock of the shelling they had just endured. Soldiers from Company B of the 21st Armored Infantry Battalion moved in to corral them. The Americans were wired tight, their fingers resting dangerously close to the trigger guards of their M1s and grease guns. There was no banter, no cigarette sharing, none of the grudging camaraderie that sometimes marked the end of a battle in the movies. The air was thick with a toxic mix of adrenaline and hatred. Roughly 60 to 80 German prisoners were gathered. They were herded roughly, shoved with gun barrels, and shouted at in a language they barely understood. The Americans stripped them of their weapons, their watches, and their souvenirs, checking quickly for hidden pistols or knives. The prisoners were then marched a short distance away from the burning buildings, towards an open, snowy field just west of the village, near the road leading to the hamlet of Bernen. As the column of prisoners trudged through the snow, the tension among the American guards spiked. An officer, whose name has been debated in historical records but remains a ghost in the official files, reportedly gave an order. It wasn't a shout, but a cold directive. The prisoners were halted. They were told to line up. The Germans, perhaps sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to look around nervously. They saw the grim faces of the young Americans. They saw the machine guns being set up on tripods, not facing outward toward a potential enemy counterattack, but facing inward toward them. The realization hit them in waves. This was not a holding area. This was a wall. For the Americans of Company B, the moment hung in a terrible suspension. They were looking at the enemy who had killed their friends. They were remembering the stories of Bulge and Malmedy. The logic of war whispered that these men were dangerous impediments to their advance. The logic of rage screamed that they deserved to die. In that snowy field, civilization held its breath. And then it exhaled. The order, when it came, was not a frantic scream of battle. It was a calculated administrative decision. A command rang out across the frozen pasture. Mow them down. The twin .30 caliber machine guns positioned on the flanks of the group opened fire simultaneously. The sound was deafening, a rapid, tearing staccato that shattered the winter stillness. The impact on the huddled mass of prisoners was immediate and catastrophic. At such close range, the heavy rounds didn't just kill. They tore through flesh and bone, knocking men backward off their feet, as if struck by invisible sledgehammers. Panic erupted. The German soldiers screamed, some diving for the ground, others trying to run towards the woods, their boots slipping on the icy mud. But there was nowhere to go. The crossfire was absolute. The field became a slaughterhouse. Grey greatcoats were shredded, sending plumes of down feathers into the air to mix with the snow. The air filled with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid stench of cordite. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the machine guns finally clicked dry, a heavy groaning silence returned to the field. But the work was not done. Mirroring the very atrocities they despised, American soldiers moved forward among the piles of bodies. Pistols were drawn. Rifles were leveled. Any movement in the pile, a twitching hand, a heaving chest, was met with a single finishing shot. Survivors who had feigned death, praying for the Americans to leave, were hunted down. The snow, pristine and white just minutes before, was now a churned slurry of mud and gore. 60 men lay dead. The soldiers of the 11th Armored Division stood over their handiwork, their barrels smoking in the cold air. In the span of a few minutes, the moral high ground of the Allied cause had been stained irrevocably. They had exacted their revenge for Malmedy, but in doing so, They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. The Thunderbolt division had struck, but the echo of this gunshot would not fade away on the wind. It would travel up the chain of command, turning a tactical victory into a strategic and political time bomb. The dead do not vanish. For days after the execution, the bodies of the German soldiers lay in the field outside Chenogne, frozen stiff in the positions where they had fallen. They became a macabre landmark in the snow, a silent testament that could not be ignored by the support units moving up behind the armored spearheads. Word of the killing spread faster than the official reports. It moved through the ranks of the 11th Armored in hushed tones, a mix of bravado and unease. Some soldiers justified it as righteous payback. Others were sickened by it. But in the military, a secret of this magnitude generates paper. An investigation was inevitably launched. Officers from the Inspector General's section arrived to document the scene. They took statements. They counted bodies. They noted the lack of weapons and the positioning of the wounds. The conclusion was inescapable. This was not a firefight. It was a mass execution. The report traveled up the chain of command with the weight of a lead brick. It went from the divisional headquarters of General Charles S. Kilburn, the commander of the 11th Armored, up to 8 Corps. The officers handling the file knew they were holding dynamite. If this leaked to the press, or if the Germans got wind of it and used it for propaganda, it could shatter Allied moral standing and invite horrific reprisals against American POWs held in Germany. General Kilburn was in a bind. His division was still in the fight, bleeding daily to close the Bulge. A full-scale court-martial investigation would pull his best officers and NCOs off the line, gutting the unit's leadership at the most critical moment of the war. He passed the problem up to the one man who had the authority to make it disappear, or to bring the hammer down. The file landed on the desk of General George S. Patton. Patton was not a man who agonized over the niceties of regulations when they interfered with the business of killing Germans. He read the report regarding the unfortunate incident at Chenogne. His reaction was characteristically blunt and brutally pragmatic. He looked at the strategic map. The Third Army was winning. The Germans were breaking. To Patton, the 11th Armored Division was a vital instrument of war, a sword that was currently bloody, but sharp. To dull that sword by launching a demoralizing investigation into men who had killed the enemy, however illegally, was tactical suicide. Patton reportedly told his subordinate officers that there will be no investigation. He reasoned that the Germans had started this cycle of brutality at Malmedy. In his diary, he noted the killing of the prisoners, but his concern was purely operational. He worried that investigating the incident would show weakness to the enemy and confusion to his own troops. He ordered the papers to be filed away, effectively buried. The Chenogne Massacre was erased from the active war record. There were no court-martials, no firing squads for the Americans who pulled the triggers. The soldiers of Company B remained on the line, carrying the memory of what they had done as they pushed deeper into the Reich. The incident became a ghost story, whispered about in veteran reunions for decades, but absent from the history books. Justice was sacrificed on the altar of victory. The massacre at Chenogne remains a jagged scar on the history of the American liberation of Europe, a dark chapter that challenges the comfortable narrative of World War II as a pristine crusade of good versus evil. We prefer our history clean, heroes in white hats, villains in black. But on that frozen field in Belgium, The lines were blurred by blood, and the good war revealed its capacity to make monsters out of ordinary men. The soldiers of the 11th Armored Division were not born killers. They were school teachers, mechanics, and farmers' sons. But war is a dark alchemy that transmutes fear into rage and grief into vengeance. The atrocity at Malmedy taught them that the rules of civilization had been suspended. Chenogne was their brutal answer. They proved that the desire for retribution is not a unique trait of any one ideology, but a universal flaw of the human condition under extreme pressure. General Patton's decision to bury the investigation was the ultimate act of cold command pragmatism. He chose the utility of a fighting division over the abstract demands of justice. In the calculus of total war, he decided that a functioning armored unit was worth more than the lives of 60 enemy prisoners. It was a decision that likely saved American lives by keeping the 11th Armored in the fight. But it cost the Third Army its moral purity. Today, Malmedy is remembered with monuments, museums, and annual ceremonies. Chenogne is largely forgotten, a footnote in the archives, a ghost story whispered among veterans who are now long gone. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the chaos of battle, the abyss waits for everyone. When the uniform is stripped away and the propaganda fades, what is left is the terrifying truth that the line between a soldier and a murderer is thinner than a trigger pull. The snow melted long ago, washing away the blood. But the question remains, when we fight monsters, how do we ensure we do not become them?